We are looking forward to this time. I give you Courtney Bailey for our third and last class of Gender in the Bible.
Thank you, Brian. It is great being with the Orlando Church for the third week, and I am encouraged by your willingness to go 3 weeks on this topic and the sense that I have that you really have engaged with the material as I have taught it. And again, it really has been a pleasure being with you. And I look forward to this last installment of our three-part series on the Bible and gender. So let me see if I can get my slide up here. And Brian, just please confirm that you see my title
Yes,
slide.
I can see the title slide you're on.
And let me just start my timer. And right. So we are concluding our midweek series, The Bible and Gender. This is, as Brian said, and Michelle, I think, said also, this is our third and final class. And as I promised, tonight, this class is going to be on 1 Timothy 2 and on Titus 2. In our previous two classes, we studied Genesis 1 to 3, and last week we did 1 Corinthians 11 and 14. This class today on 1 Timothy 2 and Titus 2 will deal with gender roles in the church, because that's what those passages speak to. As with previous classes, at the end of tonight's class, we will have a Q&A session. And so you can either put your questions in the chat or send them to Michelle directly. I want to also mention that at the end of the presentation tonight, I hope to answer a couple of the longer questions we didn't get to last week on 1 Corinthians 11 and 14. So we'll kick off the Q&A with that. So hopefully we'll get those answered as well. Okay. Well, last week we made the point that some passages in the Bible are difficult to understand, as Peter acknowledges about some of Paul's writings, which he says his letters contain some things that are hard to understand. Well, if that was true of 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Corinthians 14, it's even more true about 1 Timothy 2, 9 to 15, which contains some of the most controversial words in the Bible about the role of women in the church. And it is, in fact, one of the most difficult passages on the subject to understand. Well, like we discussed last week, if it was difficult for Peter to understand some of what Paul was saying, it's more difficult for us because we are separated from Paul's writings by time, by geography, and by culture. And so one of the important things that we have to try to do in seeking to understand the Bible is to understand the historical context behind the different writings that we're reading. That's what we refer to as the background. And this includes the social and the cultural context. So we have to try to understand by entering Paul's words, entering his world, and hearing his letter like his original audience would have, if we're going to understand in the same way that they would. And the reason why we have to do this is because a passage cannot mean today something that it did not mean to its original audience. So let's talk about the background to 1 Timothy and Titus. Both letters were written by Paul in the early 60s AD, and he writes both letters to Timothy, who is a ministry delegate of his. And he writes 1 Timothy to Timothy, who is a ministry delegate of his in Ephesus, and he writes the letter of Titus to another delegate of his, Titus, who is in Crete. And he writes both letters to address problems in the churches in these two locations. Now, although there are some differences in the two situations into which Paul is writing, there are some similarities. For instance, in both letters, we're dealing with false teachers who are teaching doctrines that Paul describes as being unhealthy for the church. And these doctrines are somehow disrupting the households which comprise the church. It also seems that one of the ways in which the households in the church were being disrupted was by the way in which the women in the church were behaving. And so Paul seeks in both letters to address how people, including women, are to properly behave in the church. And he refers to the church as a household of God. We're going to read that scripture in a few slides. Now, how I want to approach the two passages tonight is by beginning with a wide-angle shot that examines historical context for both letters, and then looks next at the literary context for both passages. And the aim of doing so is to first set the stage for a close examination of the two passages by identifying the background into which Paul was writing and the literary context in which the passages are situated. Once we've done that, then we're going to come back with a zoom shot, and we're going to closely read the passages against the background that we have established. Well, let's start talking about the background to 1 Timothy and Titus. One significant aspect of the background to both letters is what we refer to as the Greco-Roman household. Greco-Roman means essentially a combination of Greek and Roman. And so you may wonder, well, what is this Greco-Roman household? You see from the slide, I have there that the Greco-Roman household, in Greek, it's the oikos, is the socio-cultural background of Paul's letters to Timothy and Titus. And so understanding the socio-cultural background and reading the letters against it is going to help us to better understand them. This Greco-Roman household, or the oikos, refers to the fundamental unit of the Greco-Roman society. Now, we're not talking here about the nuclear family of the 21st century Western society made up of mommy, daddy, and 2.5 children. We're talking about an extended family that's headed by a male householder, or in Latin, the pater familias, the father of the family. And this household consisted not only of the father, the mother, and the children, but it would include extended family members such as the adult sons, perhaps, and their families, adult daughters, if they were unmarried or divorced, and perhaps it could include older parents, but certainly would include, in wealthier families, slaves, and the clients of this male householder, meaning the people who look to him for his social clout to help them to make their way in life. So if you think about it, this is a patriarchal structure in which the father of the household and eventually his eldest son would have all the authority. Now, according to Aristotle, every Greek city, referred to as a polis, was composed of households. So the oikos was the building block of the entire Greco-Roman civilization, and so its most basic unit. But not only did Aristotle say that every city was made up of the various households, which were like the individual building blocks, he went further to explain that in the perfect form, the household consists of slaves and free persons, and there would be these pairs, master and slave, husband and wife, father and children, and each of these pairs he outlined would relate to each other in a way in which one would submit to the other. So in a properly functioning household, it was clearly established which of the two of each of the pairs was going to be in subjection to the other one, and therefore would be expected to submit. And so because everybody knew where they fell in the system, the proper function in the household would in turn lead to a properly functioning city. So based on this philosophy and structure, the household was the fundamental unit of Greco-Roman society. And the household codes, which basically are writings that told people how they were to behave in a household, those writings would outline which of each of the usual pairs, father and children, husband and wife, master and slaves, who was to submit to who. And so this structure was considered to be integral to the stability of the society. And because it was considered to be the foundation of the Greco-Roman civilization, any kind of deviations from these norms were considered subversive of the Roman society. Well, Philip Towner, in his commentary on 1 Timothy and Titus, explains how this works. He says, within the empire, the oikos continue to be held up as a fundamental unit of the social structure. And for this reason, innovations, disturbances, evidence of poor management, etc., attracted the attention of conservative-minded observers. In the case of disruption to Christian households, such observation would quickly turn into criticism that would endanger the church's public image and put its reputation and witness within society at risk. In other words, he's saying that because it was a fundamental unit of the society, any kind of shifts from the structure in the traditional household was considered to be subversive of the social structure. And so if in a Christian household, there were any kind of disruption of the normal ways in which people related to each other, the church would come under criticism and the church's image would be sullied within the public square. So this is the background that in 1 Timothy, Paul writes against. And he writes what is essentially a household code for the church as a household of God. And in writing the letter of 1 Timothy as a household code, he's seeking to show that the church as a household is not subversive of Roman society. And he's doing this because there would have been a lot of suspicions about Christianity because it was a new and a developing religion. And so Paul's characterization of the church as a household of God and his repeated use of household imagery in the letters to Timothy and to Titus, and his use of household codes in these letters shows an effort on his part to instruct the churches which received these letters that they were to conduct themselves in a way that would not bring the gospel into disrepute. This is his motive. This is a big part of the context for these letters. Well, because the normal household patterns were thought to provide stability for the social order and deviations from it were considered subversive and brought suspicion, household codes were used by religious groups, including the Christians, to allay suspicions that they were undermining the social and political order. And that's why we have the household codes in the New Testament. In 1 Timothy and Titus, we have what we could consider to be household codes in 1 Timothy 2-3. And that would include, of course, the part of 1 Timothy 2 that we're going to be reading tonight about how the women were supposed to behave. But also in 1 Timothy 5-6, there's some instructions about slaves, and there's some instructions about rich people, and instructions about widows. In Titus 1 and Titus 2, there are instructions about leaders and older men, older women. So all of these passages are household codes that are teaching different members of the church how they are to behave. And then, of course, in the rest of the New Testament, Ephesians 5, which we referenced at different points during the series, Colossians 3, 1 Peter 2, many of us are familiar with these passages which talk about husbands and wives, about parents and children, and also about masters and slaves. Well, these household codes generally address Aristotle's peers.
She wants to go to heaven?
She's alone.
Husband and
That's
wife,
all right. She doesn't understand what she's talking about.
parents and children,
Yeah.
masters and slaves.
Ashton,
That's
lay down.
because the social structure of the ancient household would have reflected the hierarchy in the society. The relationships were clearly defined into hierarchical pairs, which were traditional and in fact predated Aristotle, but he explained them clearly as being master and slave, husband and wife, father and children. And so one, as we've said, related to one's counterpart, either with authority or in subjection. And the father, the master of the house, was the head of the household. So this is the cultural matrix into which the New Testament household codes fit. But the New Testament writers, they put a Christian spin on the dynamics between these relational pairs. They didn't overthrow them, but they redefined them and elevated them. And so they taught, yes, wives must submit to their husbands, but they said, husbands, love your wives. They said, yes, children must obey your parents, but fathers, do not exasperate your children. Yes, slaves submit to your masters, but masters, do not treat your slaves harshly. And so the New Testament household codes regulate how Christians are to behave in the household so as not to be disruptive of the existing social order, whilst at the same time seeking to effect change over time by Christianizing the existing social norms and expectations. And they did this by introducing reciprocity in relationships that were only hierarchical in the household system. So in the wider Greek society, Greco-Roman society, it was just father over mother. But within the church, there was introduced the concept of, yes, the wife should submit to her husband, but at the same time, the husband must love his wife. And so they Christianized these concepts. So the Greco-Roman household is in the background to Paul's writing, but also in the background is the emergence of the first century Greco-Roman New Roman woman, which is a form of feminist women's lib movement that's been given that description, the New Roman Woman, by scholars like Bruce Winter. This is his book here, Roman Wives, Roman Widows. And we mentioned this movement last week in relation to 1 Corinthians 11. It's characterized by the following features: by women having elaborate dress and hairstyles, which reflected unfaithfulness to male spouses and promiscuity. And you see from the cover there of Bruce Winter's book, a woman with an elaborate hairstyle, which would have connoted in that culture not just ostentatiousness, but promiscuity and availability beyond the woman's husband. Another feature was the desire of influential women to acquire for themselves and enjoy the kind of freedoms that only men enjoyed, especially at dinner drinking parties. The New Roman woman was also characterized by a desire to be unencumbered with children, and so they'd practice different types of birth control, abortion for unwanted children, and all of this was in order to pursue the kind of sexual freedom that the men in the society enjoyed. And then finally, there was this desire to take active roles in the public life, which included speaking up in the presence of men or their husbands and offering opinions and teaching and philosophizing, which were things that traditionally men would do. Well, we can see these characteristics that we've just listed here in both of the passages that we're going to consider tonight, 1 Timothy 2 and Titus 2. And all of this behavior would have been disruptive of the social order and the structure of the Greco-Roman household, and thereby it would have brought the church into disrepute. This concern is in fact behind Paul's instruction in both passages, as a quick survey of the literary context of both passages will now show. In fact, in the passages surrounding 1 Timothy 2 and Titus 2, Paul is so intent on dealing with the disruptions to the household, including the emergence of the New Roman woman, that the letters to Timothy and Titus have been criticized by scholars as accommodating the church to prevailing social values. In other words, scholars say, wow, could Paul really have written this? Because it seems like he is so intent on ensuring that the church fell in line with the expected and prevailing social attitudes. But as we will see, as we look at the literary context of both passages, the reality is more nuanced than that. So let's start with the literary context of 1 Timothy 2. Paul writes there, first of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God, our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So Paul tells the church that he wanted to pray for all people, including the kings and people in authority. And he tells them the reason he wants them to pray is in order that they, the Christians, he refers to them as we, may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. So we ask the question, why does he want them to lead peaceful and quiet lives, godly and dignified in every way? And some people say, well, he's just trying to accommodate the church to the prevailing social culture. I don't think that's correct, because he tells us why he wants them to lead these peaceful and quiet lives, godly and dignified in every way. In verse 3, he says that Christians leading peaceful, quiet lives that are godly and dignified in every way is good and pleasing in the sight of God. Well, we have to ask, well, how is that good and pleasing in the sight of God? It's good and pleasing in the sight of God because Paul tells us God desires all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. So the implication is that when Christians are not leading peaceful and quiet lives that are dignified in every way, that somehow prevents all people from coming to a knowledge of the truth and being saved. And that displeases God, because the lives of the Christians is operating as an obstacle to people hearing the message and coming into the church. And the further inference that we can draw is that Paul is saying this right here in 1 Timothy 2, because there's something about how the Christians in the church that Paul is writing to, the church in Ephesus, something about how they're living their lives that is not quiet or peaceful, and not godly and dignified in every way. And as a result, their non-Christian neighbors are being prevented from coming to a knowledge of the truth and being saved. Well, when we read a little further in the text, the literary context confirms that this is in fact the case. We read in verse 8, Paul says, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Now, stop right there. We see from verse 8 that the men in the church seem to be having angry quarrels during the church meetings, possibly involving the use of their hands. And whether those are angry gesticulations or blows in physical altercations, we don't really know. But it's clearly not living peaceful and quiet lives that are godly and dignified in every way. Well, if that's not too bad, we read about the women. Likewise, Paul says also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control. Notice that word, respectable. Not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper. Notice that word, for women who profess godliness, with good work. Let a woman learn quietly. These are some of the words that he uses early in 1 Timothy 2, with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, rather she's to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So in verse 9 to the end of the passage, we see that the women are dressing and conducting themselves in a fashion that was not considered godly and dignified either by God's standards or the social standards of the time. And that was because they were dressing ostentatiously in a way that would have been associated with promiscuous and sexually immoral behavior, as well as with this disruptive social movement referred to by scholars as a new Roman woman. Also, there was a lack of submission to husbands by wives, and that would have been disruptive of the well-defined roles and structure within the oikos that was built on the subjection by the relevant peer. And that lack of submission would also have associated them with this new Roman woman. Also disruptive of the social structure of the household and characteristic of the new Roman woman would have been the aversion to childbearing in order to pursue sexual freedom. And that would have been the opposite of love, holiness, and self-control. And this is likely what Paul is addressing in verse 15. So we can see clearly the characteristics of the new Roman woman in how the women were dressing, in their lack of self-control and ungodliness, which suggests some type of promiscuity, in their insubmissiveness, and their teaching or exercising authority over men, and in their aversion to childbearing. And this would have been the opposite of living peaceful and quiet lives, godly and dignified in every way. And since the church meetings took place in homes, in the part of the home that were open to the public, that kind of behavior would have been on public display for the watching world. And that would have brought the gospel into disrepute. And that would in turn have prevented the watching world from coming to a knowledge of the truth and being saved, because they would think those people over there are part of something that's subversive. The way in which they're conducting themselves is not something that we want to associate ourselves with. That's a disruptive group. Now, for Paul, the gospel was primary. And what I mean by that is all other concerns were secondary in his mind to the message of the gospel being correctly and attractively displayed to the lost world. And from that point of view, Paul therefore is telling the church, well, we've got to conduct ourselves, men and women, in a way that will not prove an obstacle to people hearing the gospel. Well, in 1 Timothy 3, verse 14 to 15, which is on the other end of our passage, but it's also a part of the literary context. Remember, literal context is what's around the passage. When we look at that passage, we see that Paul, having addressed how men and women and leadership were to behave in the church in order to lead peaceful and quiet lives that were godly and dignified in every way, in 1 Timothy 3:14-15, he tells Timothy why he's writing this. He says there, I hope to come to you soon, but I'm writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. So Paul is saying right here that his words, including what he writes about the woman and how they're to behave, are like a household code. And they're meant to teach the Christians in the church how they are to behave. And the church is a new, higher household of God than the Greco-Roman household. But at the same time, Paul is saying it's not one that is disruptive of the existing social standards. And the imagery that he uses here of the church being a pillar and a buttress of the truth is really quite similar to what he says early in 1 Timothy 2, where he says that, we want to live peaceful and godly lives that are quiet and dignified because we want to ensure that people can come to a saving knowledge of the truth. But he's just using different language to say the same thing. The idea here of the church being a pillar of the truth means that it supports the truth. It holds up the truth so that everyone in the unbelieving world can see it. And a buttress of the truth, meaning that it supports the truth. Well, actually, what I should have said is a pillar adorns the truth. It makes it look good. It makes it look beautiful. In fact, that is language that he uses in Titus 2, and the buttress is a support. So the Christians' lives, by not being ungodly, undignified, by their lives being quiet, by their lives being peaceful, actually makes the truth look good. And their lives hold it up to the unbelieving world so that they can see, and they don't get in the way of the truth. But the truth is able to shine through the church because they're not behaving in a way that is going to cause the unbelieving world to think, I'm not sure I want to be a part of that. So this rationale that the Christians were to lead peaceful and quiet lives that were godly and dignified in every way is behind all the various instructions that Paul gives the Christians throughout 1 Timothy. We read 1 Timothy 2:2 already, but in 1 Timothy 5:7, he talks about how they're to take care of widows in the church. And he says the reason why they're to do that is so that the church may be without reproach. He talks about women and how they're to behave. And he says the reason why he gives those instructions in 1 Timothy 5:14 is to give the adversary no occasion for slander. And in 1 Timothy 6:1, slaves are to obey their masters, etc., so the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. So you see quite clearly that what is driving Paul's instructions as to how people are to behave is that they do not bring the gospel and the church into disrepute. Well, in Titus 1:10, we find that we have a similar rationale at work in Paul's letters to Titus. Because after telling Titus in verses 5-9 that Titus needs to appoint elders and what qualities the elders should possess, Paul tells Titus why they need to be appointed as elders. And he says, the reason why we need elders is because there are many rebellious people full of meaningless talk and deception, especially those of the circumcision group. They must be silenced because they're disrupting whole households by teaching things they ought not to teach, and that for the sake of dishonest gain. So in Crete, as in Ephesus, we find that a part of the problem was that there were false teachers who were teaching things that were disrupting the oikos, the Greco-Roman household that comprised the church. Now, Paul is saying false teachers teaching these things need to be silenced because something about what they were teaching was proven disruptive of the social structure. Well, what was the nature of the false teaching that was being disruptive in this way? We can get an idea of what it was like by considering what Paul told Titus that he was to teach as opposed to the false teaching. What he tells Titus is sound doctrine as opposed to the unsound teaching of the false teachers. He says in Titus 2, but as for you, teach what accords with sound doctrine. And then he starts talking about how different people are to behave in the church. Older men are to be sober-minded. Notice that word, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and steadfastness. And older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not slaves to too much wine. Remember, drinking parties was an issue in the new Roman woman world. They're to teach what is good, and so to train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kindly submissive to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. So the men are to be dignified and self-controlled, and the women, it would seem, Paul's correcting them because they were showing evidence of the emergence of the new Roman woman in the church, in the lack of self-control, in the drinking, in the desire to be unencumbered with children. That's why they're being told to love their husbands and children. In the lack of self-control, which and the use of the word pure, perhaps connoting the lack of the need for sexual modesty as opposed to sexual promiscuity, and the lack of submissiveness to husbands. All of these things would have been a part of the disruptiveness in the church, perhaps related to this phenomenon of the new Roman woman. And all that Paul is trying to correct is because he doesn't want God's word to be reviled. Notice again that all of this behavior would have been disruptive of the social structure and likely could be related to the new Roman woman. Well, I won't spend much time here. Again, as in 1 Timothy, in Titus, the reason why Paul tells women how they should behave is that the word of God may not be reviled. Younger men are to behave in a certain way so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us, and the slaves to bear masters and so on, so that in everything they may adorn, there's that word, that's a pillar, that looks beautiful, the doctrine of God, our Savior. So, in all of these things that Paul is instructing Titus to teach the older men and women, the younger men and women, and the slaves in the household of God, all of these things that are being taught fit the roles that would be expected of each of these different groups within the oikos or the Greco-Roman household. And so considered together, it's clear that is in 1 Timothy, the reason that Paul gives for each of these groups to behave in the ways that are not disruptive is because he doesn't want anything to prevent the gospel from being heard. He wants them to adorn the gospel with their lives. He wants them not to get in the way because he wants people to come to a saving knowledge of the truth. So that is the context in which we come to 1 Timothy 2, 11 to 15. And so, having taken a wide-angle view of the 1 Timothy 2 passage, by looking at its historical and literary context, we can now zoom in on verses 11 to 15, which are the most relevant to our discussion on the Bible and gender. Now, whereas in verses 9 to 10 of 1 Timothy 2, Paul deals with women's attire, in verses 11 to 15, he deals with their behavior in relation to teaching and exercising authority in relation to men. He says, let a woman learn quietly. The Greek word there is asoukia, with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she's to remain quiet. The same Greek word, asoukia. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, if they, women, continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. Now, first of all, notice that Paul instructs the church to let the women learn. Don't miss that. We can skip it. That's significant because education was inaccessible to many women in the Greco-Roman world. And in contrast with the culture of his time, and therefore going counterculturally, Paul is here affirming the privilege and duty of women to learn as a part of the Christian community. And that, of course, just basically follows Jesus' example, who had women disciples, for example, Mary of Bethany, sitting at his feet, learning alongside the men. But whereas Paul wants women to learn, he specifies that they are to learn quietly, with all submissiveness. Now, this instruction to learn quietly with all submissiveness has obviously to do with disruptions in the house churches as a result of some women following the emerging trend of the new Roman woman. For example, by their speaking up in the presence of men. And that's why he wants them to learn quietly and to learn with submissiveness. In other words, he wants them to learn, but they're not to be disruptive and they're not to be taking over the assembly, like the new Roman women were in asserting themselves with men in the society. But notice that the word that is translated quietly or quiet, that word is sukia, is translated here quiet, but in other places, for example, in the NIV 1984, was translated, she is to be silent. However, that word sukia can mean be quiet, but it refers to a tranquility that arises from within. And I'm getting that from Vine's Dictionary of New Testament Words. It's referring more to disposition. And again, in the context, it's referring to not a quietness in terms of speech, but one in terms of demeanor. The related adjective, sukios, actually appears in 1 Timothy 2, verse 2, when Paul prays for the Christians to live peaceful and quiet lives. So the adjective of this word is the word that is translated quiet there. So it's not talking about Christians living lives where they're not talking at all. He's talking about them living lives that the demeanor of their lives is not disruptive. It's the same adjective, in fact, in 1 Peter 3:5, where Peter says, speaking of Sarah and the women in the church, having a gentle and a quiet spirit. That word quiet there is the adjective sukios. Again, that's speaking of the demeanor and not saying that women are not to speak in the church. I think that's important because the meaning of verse 12 has been repeatedly debated in relation to whether women are permitted to teach in the church or have leadership roles. And Paul's comments here are specific to the situation in Ephesus, although verses 13 to 15 seem to give them something of a universal application because he relates the reason why they are to be submissive and so on to creation. But I think when you look at the passage, it is a difficult passage. And so we need to be humble and not dogmatic because there's a lot that they would have understood in terms of context and the meaning of Paul's words that are not immediately available to us. And so the big question is, what does I do not permit a woman to teach, what I have there in the red, or to exercise authority over a man mean? Well, a lot turns on the translation of the words translated as to teach, and the words translated to exercise authority, and also on the interpretation of the grammatical structure that is represented in English by the phrase to teach or to exercise authority over a man. In other words, in the Greek, there is a grammatical structure that has had to be translated into that expression in English. Well, let's talk first about that word that is translated to teach. The Greek word translated to teach in 1 Timothy 2:12 is didaskene. It is an infinitive, and that means it is a verbal noun, and that verbal noun is derived from the Greek verb didasko, which refers to teach or teaching. So didaskene means to teach. But the question arises, what does the word didaskene mean in the context of 1 Timothy 2:12? What kind of teaching is Paul prohibiting women from doing in the church? Well, there are a number of options that scholars have put forward. Some people say he's prohibiting them from doing any kind of teaching at all anywhere in the church. Some others say no, he's just restricting them from authoritative or ecclesial, that word ecclesial having to do with the church, teaching that relates to the authority of the church. And that would include things like teaching doctrine or transmitting the apostolic gospel, what is a true gospel that is being handed on. Or it could refer to a restriction against teaching as an elder because right after we get to 1 Timothy 3 and we start talking about elders. And then some people say, well, he's just restricting them from teaching in a domineering way, and they get there by combining that word didaskein with the other word in the passage, which is authentein. And that word authentein is translated in the ESV as to exercise authority. It is an infinitive, it's a verbal noun, and it is really has been the subject of much scholarly debate in this passage in trying to understand what exactly it means. One of the challenges we have with this word is the only place it appears in the entire New Testament is right here. And that means we don't have other places that we can look at in the New Testament to try to, by context, ascertain what it could possibly mean. Well, here are some suggestions that have been put forward. Some people say it could mean to have authority or to exercise authority. Some say it has a more a more negative meaning, to dominate or to lord it over. And others say even more negative, to usurp authority. So the idea of women taking over and overpowering the men. That's what Paul perhaps is restricted. Now, I've got a slide here, which I apologize for. But one of the reasons I put this slide up is to show that those two words, we don't only have to figure out what they mean, we have to figure out what they mean based on the way they appear in the sentence in Greek. In other words, the translation of these two words is also affected by what we refer to as the grammatical syntax of the sentence in which they appear in the Greek text. Syntax is how the words work together in a sentence according to Greek grammar. So we have that first word, didaskein, which I put the English here to teach. That's followed by the Greek, let's call it a conjunction, which could be but or and. And then this sort of negative word, it negates, uk, which means not. And then we have a word for woman or wife, and epitrepo, which means I permit. And then we have this word ude, which is translated nor, authentein, which it could have one of those three meanings we just talked about, andros, man or husband. And then we have the Greek word ala, but, and then ena, which means to be in, and then sukia, quietness. Now, I've kind of done that deliberately, because one thing that I wanted to help us to understand is we think it's very clear in English, but before it gets to English, it's got to be translated out of the Greek. And the Greek syntax has some effect on how the words mean when they are put together. Well, based on the syntax, the Greek grammar would mean that Paul's expression would function as a neither nor statement. So kind of like, I don't permit a woman to teach or to have authority. But the words authentate and didaskein in that neither nor sentence would either be viewed positively, both positively, or both negatively, or one positively and the other negatively. Let me show you what I mean. So here's one suggested possible translation. And here, both words are positive. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. Or it could be both negative. I do not permit a woman to teach error or to domineer a man or usurp authority. And here's another positive and negative. I do not permit a woman to teach or to domineer a man or to usurp authority. So we're talking, well, the second one was both negative, and this third one is positive and then negative. And then you have some translations that would combine the two words to mean something like to teach authoritatively, or to teach so as to gain mastery, or to teach a man
I put one shake of white pepper in there.
Okay, so the difficulty in translating expression can be seen from the differences in the various translations. And here's a sampling. Here is about 13 translations go with, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority or have authority over a man. The ASV goes with, I I permit not a woman to teach or to have dominion over a man, but to be in quietness. The King James Version, I suffer not a woman to teach or to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. And then the CEB, I don't allow a wife, or could be a woman, to teach or to control her husband or a man. Instead, she should be a quiet listener. And then they should be silent and not be allowed to teach or to tell men what to do. So we can see from all these different translations that it is a very difficult sentence to translate. And you could go in a number of different directions. Well, what is clear is that there's not enough evidence to suggest that Paul is completely prohibiting women from teaching in the church. The context is women teaching error and in an insubmissive way that was disruptive of the accepted social order of the household. And that was bringing the church into reproach in the eyes of the unbelieving world. I think that is a kind of teaching and insubmission that Paul is clearly prohibited in 1 Timothy 2:12. Now, I want to focus on his statement in verse 12 that women are to remain quiet. And as I said earlier, the Greek word there is esukio. Now, that statement, along with the rest of the verse, has in the past been used in traditions out of which the ICOC churches come, I'm referring to the Restoration Movement, to suggest that women can't speak in the church. In some places, it's been said they can't even say amen. But I don't think that's what Paul is saying. As I mentioned, the NIV 1984 translated this as she must be silent. But in the 2011 NIV, this was corrected to she must be quiet. And I think that's because, as we said earlier, the Greek word translated quiet, sukia, really means a tranquility from arising from within. So it's a quietness of demeanor. It's referring, even in the context, more to the disposition of this woman, the fact that she must be submissive. So it's not quietness of speech, but of demeanor. And so it's saying that women are to have a humble, submissive demeanor and not a disruptive, contentious one, in order for them to learn and for the worship of the church to not be disrupted. By the way, that quiet, submissive demeanor is also required of men for them to learn. But Paul is here addressing the women because this is the problem that they were presenting at the time. But what is clear, he certainly was not saying that women are unable to speak or should not speak in the church. Verses 13 to 15 are perhaps the most difficult in the passage, which talk about the fact that Adam was formed first and Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. Now, I want you, as we try to figure out what does he mean, to note the following connections with the context that I painted earlier. Firstly, notice that the women were being deceived by false teachers like Eve was being deceived by the serpent. Look at 1 Timothy 5:15 to see what I mean. And then secondly, this encouragement to bear children connects with the false teachers who forbade marriage in 1 Timothy 4, as well as with the new Roman woman and her aversion to having children. And so I think a way into understanding what Paul is saying here is understand that he's responding to that context. Now he begins with the word for, which is a connecting word. And so it's pointing back to verse 12. Paul is giving right here the reason why he does not permit a woman to teach or to authentain a man, whatever that word means, but insists instead that she must be quiet. And he says the reason why he doesn't permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man is because Adam was formed first, and then Eve. And it was Eve, not Adam, who was the one who was deceived and became a transgressor. Well, whatever these words mean, Paul's reference to the original creation order and to the fall seem to suggest a basis for his prohibition that is rooted in universal principles that go beyond the situation in Ephesus. And in the background, I think, is a new Roman woman. The fact that women were deceived by the false teachers to adopt a posture of insubmissiveness towards men and seeking to be first, or to not recognize the leadership of men in the church. it's been suggested that what Paul is dealing with in 1 Timothy 2:13-15 is either a false myth that comes out of a sort of early form of Gnosticism, or from the worship of Artemis. And there you have on the right side an image of the idol that is set up in Ephesus to Artemis. And either Gnosticism or the cult of Artemis had a false teaching or a myth within Ephesus that put women before men. In other words, they taught that either women came before men, or that women taught men, and as a result of teaching men, men had life. And there are actually different writings in Gnosticism and within the Artemis cult that would suggest that kind of false teaching. So some people think perhaps Paul is trying to correct some of that erroneous way of teaching by asserting the Genesis account, which teaches clearly that men were created before women. Well, there are a lot of different suggestions that we could look at for 1 Timothy 2:13-14. One is the reference to Adam being formed first means that he had the right of the firstborn. That's primogeniture. Or quite simply, like in 1 Corinthians 11, which we looked at last week, the idea is that women should not teach or exercise authority over men, because God made men first, women came from men, and so men have authority over women by virtue of the order of creation. That actually is a thought that is not alien to Paul. We've seen that in 1 Corinthians 11. Some say, well, it's just a chronological retelling of the Genesis story. So the idea that man was formed, that's creation. Eve was a transgressor, that's a fall. And then the idea of being saved refers to redemption. As I said from the previous slide, another suggestion is it's a response to false myths from the Artemis cult that women were formed first or responsible for the origin of men. And then a very dangerous interpretation is when Paul talks about Eve being deceived. Some people say, oh, that means that women are more susceptible to deception than men. I don't think that's what Paul means, because the Bible doesn't teach that generally. And if that were the real issue, then Paul would prohibit them not just from teaching men, they would be prohibited from teaching women as well. And we know from Titus 2, which we'll look at in a second, that he in fact says that women are to teach women. And then a more, I think, palatable suggestion for what Paul means when he says that Eve was deceived is that this could be a pointed reference to the women in Ephesus who were being deceived by the false teachers. In other words, they were teaching error and domineering men because they'd been led astray by the false teachers, and so they were overstepping the bounds like Eve did with Adam. Well, if you were to ask me which of these I would go with, I would think Adam formed first. Paul's talking about headship, like in 1 Corinthians 11, and I think that last suggestion that the reference to Eve be deceived as a pointed reference to the women in Ephesus who were being deceived by the false teachers makes the most sense to me. Well, then 1 Timothy 2:15, that's a difficult one. The suggestions are that we're talking about Eve or Mary, by extension women, being saved through the birth of Christ. Another suggestion is that women were going to be kept physically safe through the difficulty of childbirth, because it was believed that Artemis would be one of the functions of Artemis was she was a god who kept women safe during childbirth. And as you can imagine, at that time, given the level of medical care, it was almost 50-50 whether you're going to make it through. And so Paul would be talking about staying with Christ and not going to Artemis. But I think what, again, to me seems a more reasonable interpretation is perhaps Paul is referring to the fact that the women in Ephesus would be saved by a return to traditional female roles, given the context that we have looked at in some detail. And then some suggest that the reference to bearing children is a response to the false teaching that discouraged marriage and childbearing. Well, I think you've seen that this is a difficult passage. It's directed to a specific situation, although clearly there are some general principles that remain applicable. And so I think we've got to be humble and not dogmatic, but it's clear to me that there's nothing in the passage that provides sufficient basis to exclude women from teaching in the church. The question is whether they can teach to men or should they only teach to women. That's another question. But clearly the passage is not saying that women can't have any role in speaking and teaching in the church. And I think the passage also suggests that we have to take into consideration the culture within which we exist, so that how we conduct ourselves does not in fact become an obstacle to people hearing the gospel. Well, quickly to look at Titus 2:3-5, Paul says there, older women are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They're to teach what is good. He prayed the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure work at home, kind and submissive to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. Well, as I've said, I think we have here in the background the new Roman woman. But again, don't miss the fact that Paul wants women to teach. At least it's clear that he wants older women to teach the younger women. And he wants them at the same time to conduct themselves in a way that is submissive and that is not disruptive of the social order. So we have that interesting expression that they're to be busy at home. Well, does that mean that they're to stay home and just do housework? I don't think that's what Paul is saying. I think in the context in which he's writing, the Greco-Roman society would have been divided into a public sphere, the politia, which it was the primary domain of men. And there was the domestic sphere, the oikos, which would be the primary sphere of women. And in that culture and at that time, he's saying he wants women who are trying to leave behind their home responsibilities and to assert themselves in the public sphere in a way that was insubmissive and disruptive. He's saying he wants them to engage with the roles that they have as women within that social context. So I think the big question that we have when we read these two passages is whether women can teach or lead in the church. We know from 1 Corinthians 14, which we studied last week, that women are not to speak disruptively in the church, but to be silent and to be in submission. But we also know that even in that church in Corinth, that notwithstanding what Paul says there in 1 Corinthians 14, women were praying and prophesying in the church, and the only difficulty that Paul had was with them doing so with their heads uncovered. We know from 1 Timothy 2:11-15, which we looked at tonight, that women are not permitted to teach or to exercise authority over a man. But we do know from Titus 2 that women did teach other women. And we know from the references to Timothy's mother and his grandmother teaching him that women did teach children. We also know that Priscilla and Aquila in a private setting taught Apollos the word of God more accurately in the book of Acts. And we also know that whether as deacons or as the wives of deacons or female deacons, women had a role in leadership in the churches. And you can read that in 1 Timothy 3. We also know the churches were in households, and that would have given some level of influence to women such as Lydia. The church met in her household. So the woman did have a role in the leadership of the church. Well, I think if I can land the plane before I get into quickly the questions from last week, here are a few takeaways that we can easily discern from the two passages we studied tonight. Women can in fact speak and teach in the church and should do so in ways that are culturally acceptable. Creation ordering of male and female relationships has some effect on gender roles in teaching and or exercising authority in the church. And then both men and women should conduct themselves in the church in a way that would positively display the gospel to the unbelieving world. Very quickly, a couple questions from last week on 1 Corinthians 11. From my understanding, it sounds like the roles that men and women play is a system created to try to deal with the issues caused by the fall. Since men will try to rule over women, they're now told to lead by serving. And since women will fight for control, they're now being told to submit because they trust that God will address any issues that the male leader might be causing. So do you believe that these roles were not present before the fall in the Garden of Eden and therefore will also not be in heaven? Well, I think to respond, in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul seems to base his argument for gender roles where men have headship and women are to be subordinate on the creation order. And that would mean that these roles are not in response to the fall, but are associated with how men and women were created to be in the first place. What we have in the fall is a corruption of these roles into a dynamic in which men and women fight for control instead of harmoniously living together in the way that God created them to be. That is by complementing each other and abiding by the creation order where men are given headship and they exercise it lovingly in servitude, understand that the woman is created from the man's side as his equal, and women submit to this headship and not seek to take over control. Matthew 12 and Matthew 22 tells us at the resurrection, there's going to be no marriage because we're going to be like the angels. That seems to suggest that there's going to be some change in gender roles. We certainly will have male and female still, but it's not clear exactly how the roles might be changed by the fact that there's not going to be any marriage in heaven. That's a bit murky. And so I wouldn't go beyond saying that it suggests that there are likely to be some change in those roles at the resurrection. Second question. In current American culture, we have women openly not wearing head coverings. For this to be the current situation, it means that somewhere in the past, women started to go against the culture, thus creating a new culture. Jesus challenged many cultural norms that were associated with women. So do you believe these women who change the cultural head coverings were being courageous like Jesus or were being unrighteous in not following Paul's teaching? Then based on that, do you believe women nowadays that don't wear coverings are supporting this courageous change or supporting unrighteous rebellion? Well, I think the question assumes that there's a connection over time between American culture and the New Testament Greco-Roman culture that formed the backbone of Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians 11. In fact, there is no such connection. The fact that women in America do not wear head coverings whilst praying in public does not mean that that arose because at some point along the way, there was a rejection of the New Testament Greco-Roman culture behind 1 Corinthians 11. I think American culture developed independently of that culture and is likely unrelated to it. In fact, at the time of Paul's writing, there would have been in existence cultures which did not require women to cover their heads, just as there are cultures which exist today, even in the US, that require women to cover their heads. This can be illustrated by the fact that even in Paul's time, there were different customs in relation to men covering their head. In fact, the preference for men to cover their heads in 1 Corinthians 11 reflects a regional culture. The Greeks, which was a dominant custom in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, would bare their heads for worship, whilst, as I said last week, the Romans would pull their toga down. So that reflects the fact that it is a sort of a cultural thing that's based geographically and based in time. Culture also changes over time, and it varies with geography and not necessarily as a result of resisting oppressive gender distinctions. And by the way, the head coverings that we're talking about are not like, the burqa or something like that. It wasn't something oppressive. It was just something that culturally was conceived as being reverential. And that picture you're looking at there was taken at the Western Wall in Jerusalem in 2016. Notice that only men are in the photo. And that's because men and women did not commingle at the wall, but they had separate sections. Notice also that the heads of all the men are covered. And so if you didn't have a hat or a cap, then you were given a head covering. Those are those white things that the men are wearing, because the Western Wall was a site for prayer. And in the existing Jewish culture, men had to cover their heads in prayer, public prayer. The women had to cover their shoulders and legs above the knees, but not their heads. You see, it's a cultural thing that is not related directly to what we read in 1 Corinthians 11. It's something that's varying over time and in space. Kind of like, I went to the Bahamas to speak a couple of weeks ago, and I made sure to ask them, how do you want me to dress on Sunday morning? Because even though we're two islands fairly close together, our culture changes. It used to be in Kingston, we used to wear jacket and tie. That has changed. I wanted to make sure that when I presented myself, I was dressed in a way that they would consider to reflect a proper decorum for worship. I think that's what we have going on, and not so much a rebellion against oppression to gender practices that are holding women back in 1 Corinthians 11. Then finally, someone asked me for the concordance numbers from Strong's Concordance for Hebrew and Greek words. Here they all are. I won't tarry long here because you have a video, you can come back to it. If you haven't got your screenshot yet, I am sorry. The video will be available, and it's time for Q&A. Let's see how much time we have for you to pepper me with some more questions.